Every letter you have ever read, every word you have ever written, the alphabet that carries them traces back to one small strip of coastline in what is now Lebanon. The Phoenicians did not conquer the world with armies. They conquered it with ships, with trade, with a writing system so elegant and so practical that every literate civilization on Earth eventually adopted a version of it. They controlled the color purple, a dye so rare and so expensive that wearing it became synonymous with royal power across the ancient world. They sailed beyond the edge of the known world, reaching Britain for tin and possibly circumnavigating Africa. And when Alexander the Great decided he needed to destroy their greatest city, he had to build a causeway half a mile long across open water to reach it, because no one had ever figured out how to take the island fortress of Tyre by sea. So how does a civilization that invented the alphabet, mastered the Mediterranean, and resisted the greatest army of the ancient world for 7 months, how does it end up forgotten, absorbed, erased? That is what this story is about. The coast of what is now Lebanon is not a particularly inviting stretch of geography. The mountains, the Lebanon Range, press down almost to the water's edge, leaving only a narrow ribbon of coastal plain between the slopes and the sea. There is not enough flat agricultural land to support a large population through farming alone. The harbours, however, are excellent. The coastline is indented in ways that provide natural shelter for ships. The timber growing on those mountain slopes, the famous cedars of Lebanon, prized across the ancient world for their size and quality, was available in quantities no other region of the eastern Mediterranean could match. And the sea itself, extending westward, offered access to every corner of the Mediterranean world. The people who settled this coastline and built their cities in the harbour mouths were not a single unified nation with a clear origin story. They were a collection of city communities, Byblos in the north, Sidon in the middle, Tyre in the south, and several others, each with its own ruling dynasty, its own patron deity, and its own commercial networks. The name Phoenician was given to them by the Greeks, derived from the Greek word for the colour purple, a reference to the famous dye that would become their most recognizable product. They called themselves, as far as we can tell from the limited surviving sources, by the names of their cities. A man from Tyre was Tyrian. A man from Sidon was Sidonian. The broader identity we call Phoenician was, at least in the early period, more an external perception than a self-conscious collective identity. The earliest documented contact between these coastal cities and the broader ancient Near Eastern world comes from Egyptian records. Byblos, the northernmost of the major Phoenician cities, had a relationship with Egypt going back to the 3rd millennium BC. Egyptian texts from the Old Kingdom period record the import of Lebanese cedar timber, which Egypt desperately needed and could not produce locally. The Egyptians had no significant timber of their own. The Nile Valley produces date palms and a few other species, but nothing suitable for large-scale construction or shipbuilding. The great temples and palaces, the flagpoles and roofing beams, the ships that carried Egyptian trade, all of this required cedar from Lebanon, and the city of Byblos sat at the most accessible point along the coast for Egyptian merchant ships arriving from the south. The relationship between Byblos and Egypt was so close that Egyptian cultural influence permeated the city. Egyptian objects, statues, jewelry, inscribed objects have been found in Byblos in quantities that suggest this was not merely a trading relationship, but something approaching cultural integration. Biblian rulers used Egyptian titles. The local cult adopted Egyptian religious elements, and the Egyptians in turn named the papyrus scrolls they traded, writing material that would eventually spread across the entire Mediterranean world after Byblos. The word Bible, which came to mean the book in Greek, derives from the Greek name for Byblos. Every time anyone uses the word bibliography, they are using a word that traces back to this small Phoenician harbour city. Tyre occupied a different geographic position and developed a different character. Located on a rocky island about half a kilometre off the coast, Tyre was naturally defensible in a way that mainland cities were not. Its position at sea gave it a second harbour on its landward side. Ships could approach from either direction depending on the prevailing winds. And this combination of defensibility and dual harbour access made it the natural centre of maritime commerce once the Phoenician cities began their major period of expansion. The Phoenician harbour cities participated in the late Bronze Age trading world, the same interconnected network of exchange that linked Egypt, the Hittites, Mycenaean Greece, Cyprus, and the Levantine coast. They were not the dominant power in this network. That position belonged to Egypt in the south and the Hittites in the north. But they were essential facilitators, providing the cedar timber that everyone needed, and the specialized craft goods, including glass and dyed textiles, that Phoenician craftspeople had developed distinctive expertise in producing. Around 1200 BC, the world in which the Phoenician cities had operated for centuries collapsed. The Bronze Age collapse, the system-wide crisis that destroyed the Hittite Empire, wiped out the Mycenaean palace kingdoms, and disrupted the trading networks across the entire Eastern Mediterranean, removed most of the major powers that had competed with or controlled the Levantine coast. For the Phoenician cities, this catastrophe was also, paradoxically, an opportunity. The immediate disruption was real and serious. The trading networks that had provided Phoenician merchants with their commercial foundations were broken. The Egyptian Empire, which had been the primary customer for Lebanese cedar and the dominant regional power along the Levantine coast, was retreating from its imperial position. The new kingdom was entering a long decline, and Egyptian control over Canaan and the Syrian coast was ending. The Mycenaean Greeks, who had been active trading partners and occasional rivals in the Aegean, had collapsed entirely. The world of 1200 BC was smaller, poorer, and less connected than the one that had preceded it. But the Phoenician cities, unlike the palace economies of the Mycenaeans and the Hittites, were not built on a single, centralized institution whose failure could bring down the entire system. They were trading cities, flexible, commercially oriented, capable of adapting their networks to new circumstances, because the network itself, rather than any single political structure, was the foundation of their wealth. When the Bronze Age palace economies collapsed, the Phoenician cities survived, and they began to fill the commercial vacuum that the collapse had created. The 12th and 11th centuries BC saw the rise of Tyre as the dominant Phoenician city. The process is documented partly in the Hebrew Bible, a useful, if always requiring careful interpretation, source for Phoenician history, given the close relationship between Phoenicia and Israel during this period, and partly in the expanding archaeological record of Phoenician activity across the Mediterranean. Under a dynasty of kings, of whom Hiram I, who ruled in the 10th century BC, is the best documented, Tyre developed from a significant regional harbour into the commercial centre of the entire Eastern Mediterranean. It was during this period, sometime in the 12th or 11th century BC, the precise date is debated among scholars, that the Phoenicians developed and began to disseminate what would become the most consequential intellectual invention in human history, the alphabet. Writing had existed for 2,000 years before the Phoenician alphabet. The Sumerians had developed cuneiform, a complex system using wedge-shaped marks to represent syllables and words that required years of specialized training to learn. The Egyptians had hieroglyphics, equally complex, with hundreds of individual signs. Even Linear B, the Mycenaean writing system, required knowledge of roughly 90 signs plus a set of ideograms. All of these systems placed literacy behind a significant barrier of specialized training. The Phoenician alphabet was different in a fundamental way. It contained 22 letters, each representing a single consonant sound. There were no vowels. The reader supplied them from context, as speakers of Hebrew and Arabic still do with their related scripts. Today, 22 signs to learn rather than hundreds. The entire system could be acquired in days rather than years. This radical simplification of the technology of writing made literacy accessible to people who would never have had the time or resources to master a syllabic or logographic system. The Phoenicians did not create this system from scratch. It developed from earlier experimental writing systems used in the Levantine region, including the Proto-Sinaitic script, which itself seems to have been derived from Egyptian hieroglyphics, adapted into a simpler consonantal system. But the Phoenicians standardized it, used it consistently in their commercial records, and, most importantly, spread it across the Mediterranean through their trading contacts. The Greeks adopted the Phoenician alphabet in the 9th or 8th century BC, adding vowel signs to produce the ancestor of all modern European alphabets. The Aramaic script derived from Phoenician and became the ancestor of the Arabic, Hebrew, and several other Near Eastern scripts in use today. The alliance between Hiram I of Tyre and the Israelite kings, first David, then Solomon, is documented in considerable detail in the Hebrew Bible, and the broad outline of what it describes is consistent with what archaeology confirms about Phoenician commercial activity in the 10th century BC. This makes it one of the more reliably documented episodes in early Phoenician history, even though the biblical account naturally presents events from an Israelite rather than a Phoenician perspective. The relationship was commercially rational for both sides. Tyre had merchant ships, skilled craftspeople, and access to the Mediterranean trading world. Israel, under Solomon, had wealth, agricultural land, and a strategic position that gave Tyre access to the Red Sea, and through it, to the trade routes of the Arabian Peninsula and East Africa, that Phoenician ships could not easily reach by sailing south around the Sinai. The cedar for Solomon's temple in Jerusalem came from Lebanon, transported by Phoenician workers and paid for in grain and oil. The ships that Solomon sent on trading expeditions to the land of Ophir, the source of the gold, precious stones, and exotic animals described in the biblical account, were built and crewed with Phoenician expertise. The specific arrangement described in 1 Kings involves Hiram supplying craftsmen as well as materials. A Phoenician metalworker named Hiram of Tyre, described as skilled in working bronze, is credited with making the major bronze furnishings for Solomon's temple. The precision of these details, the quantities of cedar and cypress delivered, the weight of gold sent in return, the specific description of the metalwork, gives the account a specificity that suggests it draws on actual records rather than purely legendary elaboration. The commercial network that Phoenician traders were building during this period extended far beyond the immediate Levantine coast. Cyprus, the large island sitting about 100 kilometers west of the Syrian coast, became an early and important Phoenician presence. The island had copper deposits that had been worked since the Bronze Age. The word copper itself derives from Cyprus through Latin, and its position at the western end of the Levantine coast made it a natural stopping point for ships heading further west into the Aegean and beyond. From Cyprus, Phoenician traders moved west along the established sea routes of the Mediterranean. The island of Rhodes was another early stopping point. The coasts of Greece and the Aegean islands saw Phoenician commercial activity in the 10th and 9th centuries BC, documented both in archaeological finds, Phoenician objects in Greek contexts, and in Greek literary tradition, which preserves memories of Phoenician traders as skilled, sometimes tricky, commercial operators. The goods that moved through these networks were varied. Bronze and other metals in raw and worked forms were major commodities, as were the luxury items that Phoenician craftspeople specialized in producing: carved ivory, glass objects, fine metalwork, and above all, the dyed textiles that would become synonymous with Phoenician wealth. Agricultural products, wine, olive oil, grain, moved in both directions. And always, underlying everything, was the information that traders accumulate: knowledge of markets, routes, of what was available where and at what price. The administrative systems that managed this commerce were organized at the level of the individual city rather than any centralized Phoenician state. Each city had its own merchant families, its own commercial relationships, its own system of weights and measures. Contracts, formalized in the Phoenician alphabetic script that made documentation accessible to a wide range of commercial actors, governed relationships between trading partners. The legal framework was built around commercial custom and the enforcement power of the city authorities, rather than any imperial legal system. This decentralized structure gave Phoenician commerce extraordinary flexibility. When one market closed, another could be cultivated, because the network was not dependent on any single political relationship. The founding of Carthage is one of the most famous stories from the ancient world, and like most famous ancient foundation stories, it combines a kernel of historical reality with considerable legendary elaboration. The classical tradition preserves multiple versions of the story, but the core narrative, as told by later Roman and Greek authors drawing on earlier Phoenician traditions, involves a Tyrian princess named Elissa, known to the Romans as Dido, who fled from Tyre after her brother Pygmalion murdered her husband to seize his wealth. She sailed west with a group of followers and, upon reaching the North African coast, negotiated with the local Berber population for land. The famous detail of this negotiation, that she asked only for as much land as could be enclosed by a single ox hide, then cut the hide into the thinnest possible strips to enclose a substantial area, may be a folk etymology explaining the name of the hill on which Carthage was built, but it captures something true about the practical intelligence and commercial creativity that characterized Phoenician culture. The historical date usually given for Carthage's founding is 814 BC, derived from ancient sources that counted back from known dates. Archaeological evidence suggests Phoenician presence at the site from the late 9th century BC, which is consistent with this traditional date within the margins of uncertainty involved. The location was exceptionally well chosen, a promontory on the North African coast in what is now Tunisia, with a natural harbour on each side, positioned to dominate the central Mediterranean, the narrow stretch of water between North Africa and Sicily that any ship sailing from east to west or from north to south had to cross. Carthage was not the only Phoenician colonial foundation in the Western Mediterranean, but it became by far the most important. The Phoenicians established trading posts and then settlements at multiple points along the North African coast, in Sicily, in Sardinia, in Spain, and possibly even farther west. These settlements were not colonies in the Greek sense, large-scale migrations of surplus population establishing new cities that then became independent states. They were commercial foundations, strategically located harbours where Phoenician merchants could resupply, shelter, trade with local populations, and extend their reach into regions where no Eastern Mediterranean power had previously operated. The motivation for this westward expansion was metal. The Bronze Age had created an enormous demand for copper and tin, and those materials were not available in the Eastern Mediterranean in sufficient quantities. Tin in particular, the minority ingredient in bronze, came from the far west, from Britain, from the mines of Brittany in what is now France, and from deposits in the Iberian Peninsula. Phoenician traders who could reach these western sources and bring the metal east could command premium prices in the markets where bronze production was essential. The silver mines of Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, were equally attractive. Ancient sources describe Phoenician traders arriving at the Strait of Gibraltar, sailing through into the Atlantic, and returning with so much silver that they could not fit it all into their ships. The wealth that came back from the Western Mediterranean fueled the construction of Carthage and the other Western Phoenician settlements, and it also funded the political independence of the Phoenician cities from whatever great power happened to be dominant in the East at any given time. The relationship between Carthage and Tyre, its mother city, was formalized through regular tribute payments. Carthage sent a portion of its revenue to the temples of Tyre in recognition of its origin. This was not political subordination. Carthage governed itself through its own institutions from an early stage, but it was a continuing acknowledgement of connection, maintained across centuries, even as Carthage grew larger and more powerful than the city that had founded it. The rise of the Assyrian Empire to dominance over the Near East in the 9th and 8th centuries BC presented the Phoenician cities with a challenge that they had not previously faced in this form: how to maintain commercial independence and prosperity within the sphere of a land-based military empire that could, if it chose to, destroy any city that refused its demands. The Assyrian approach to the Phoenician cities was pragmatic rather than destructive. The Assyrians were not interested in burning Tyre or Sidon. Burning them would eliminate the revenue stream that regular tribute provided, and the Assyrian Empire ran, in significant part, on tribute. The Phoenician cities were productive and wealthy, and the most productive use of Assyrian military power in their regard was not conquest and destruction, but the credible threat of it, sufficient to compel regular tribute payments without actually having to carry out the threat. The Phoenician cities, for their part, were equally pragmatic. They paid what was demanded, maintained their commercial operations, and continued to generate the wealth that made paying tribute possible without threatening their basic prosperity. The Assyrian royal annals record tribute from Tyre and Sidon in the form of gold, silver, cedar wood, and other valuable commodities, the same goods that Phoenician traders sold across the Mediterranean, a portion of which was now routed to the Assyrian treasury rather than to Phoenician profit. This arrangement required careful calibration on both sides. If the Assyrian demands were too high, the incentive for the Phoenician cities to resist, or to flee their wealth westward to Carthage and the other colonies, became compelling. If they were too low, the Assyrian military reputation for enforcement of tributary obligations would suffer. The surviving Assyrian records suggest that the relationship was periodically punctuated by Assyrian military pressure, campaigns along the Levantine coast, demonstrations of force near Phoenician cities, and occasional actual confrontation, but that outright destruction of the major cities was generally avoided. There were exceptions. The Assyrian king Sennacherib, the same ruler who besieged Jerusalem in 701 BC and left the famous account of shutting Hezekiah like a caged bird, also conducted military operations along the Phoenician coast, and the sources record the flight of the Tyrian king Elulaios to Cyprus to escape Assyrian pressure. The city was not destroyed, but its commercial position was temporarily disrupted, and the king's flight illustrated the ultimate fragility of the arrangement. When Assyrian pressure became intense enough, the wealthy and mobile could escape to the Western colonies, taking their assets with them. The transmission of Phoenician craft skills to neighboring and overlapping cultures during this period was not simply a byproduct of trade. It was itself a commercial and political strategy. Phoenician craftspeople were in demand across the ancient Near East. The Assyrian palaces used Phoenician ivory carvers and metalworkers to produce the luxury goods that displayed imperial wealth. The Phoenician skill in glass production, a technology they had developed to a high degree, was sought across the region. By making themselves indispensable as suppliers of specialized expertise, the Phoenician cities added another layer to the network of mutual interest that discouraged their destruction. The construction and maintenance of a Phoenician war fleet during this period served both defensive and offensive purposes. The same ships that carried commercial cargo could be equipped for combat. Phoenician warships, sleek, oared vessels developed from the merchant ships that had to be capable of both speed and cargo capacity, were among the most formidable in the Mediterranean. The ability to deploy naval force gave the Phoenician cities a deterrent against maritime rivals and a means of protecting the sea routes on which their commercial network depended. To understand the economic power of the Phoenician cities, it is necessary to understand two products in particular: the purple dye, known as Tyrian purple, and glass. Both were products in which Phoenician craftspeople had achieved a level of quality and scale that no competitor could match, and both commanded prices that made them among the most valuable commodities in the ancient Mediterranean economy. Tyrian purple was extracted from the murex snail, specifically from two species, Murex brandaris and Murex trunculus, both of which inhabit the shallow waters of the eastern Mediterranean coast. The dye is produced from a gland in the snail's body and undergoes a complex chemical process, requiring exposure to air and sunlight to develop its characteristic color. The process is extraordinarily labor-intensive. Producing a single gram of pure dye requires approximately 10,000 snails. The dye that results is not a single color, but a range, from deep blue-purple to crimson, depending on the species used, the method of extraction, and the mordants applied during the dyeing process. The scent of the production process was famously unpleasant. The decomposing snails that littered Phoenician harbor areas were noticed and commented on by ancient visitors. The archaeological evidence confirms the scale of the industry. Mounds of crushed murex shells, sometimes meters deep, have been found at multiple Phoenician sites, representing the accumulated waste of centuries of industrial dye production. The value of the finished product more than compensated for the difficulty of production. Purple textiles were more expensive by weight than almost any other commodity traded in the ancient world. By the Roman period, when the demand for purple had expanded dramatically as Roman aristocratic culture developed an obsession with the color, purple cloth could be worth its weight in silver. In the earlier Phoenician period, the price was similarly extraordinary, and access to purple textiles functioned as a marker of royal and aristocratic status across the entire ancient world. The Egyptians wore purple. The Assyrian kings dressed their courts in purple. The Achaemenid Persian emperors collected Phoenician purple textiles. The later Roman emperors would make wearing certain shades of purple a legal privilege of the imperial family alone, a legal restriction that traces back to the extraordinary scarcity and value that Phoenician production had established. Every subsequent association between purple and royalty, every purple robe, in every royal ceremony from the ancient world to the present, reflects the commercial achievement of the murex dye industry that the Phoenician cities had built and controlled. Glass production was equally significant, though less symbolically loaded. The Phoenicians did not invent glass. It had been produced in Egypt and Mesopotamia before the Phoenician cities became the dominant producers. But they developed both the technical quality and the commercial scale of glass production to a degree that outpaced every competitor. Phoenician glass, clear, finely blown, available in a range of colors, became the standard of quality in the ancient Mediterranean world. The technique of core-formed glass vessels, in which molten glass was wound around a core and shaped by rollers, produced the small perfume bottles and cosmetic containers that are among the most recognizable Phoenician artifacts. Blown glass, a technique that appeared somewhat later, possibly developing in the Phoenician or Syro-Palestinian region in the 1st century BC, made glass vessels available in larger sizes and eventually much lower prices, beginning the democratization of glass that would eventually make it an ordinary household material rather than a luxury product. The wine and olive oil that moved through Phoenician trading networks were important commodities in their own right, though less dramatically valuable than purple or glass. Phoenician wine, produced in the coastal vineyards of Lebanon and transported in distinctive amphorae, reached markets from Egypt to Spain. And Phoenician olive oil similarly moved through the entire commercial network. When Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon, the king who destroyed Solomon's temple in Jerusalem in 586 BC, the same king who commissioned the Hanging Gardens, the same king whose name appears in the book of Daniel, turned his attention to the Phoenician coast. The city of Tyre presented a problem that no previous conqueror had successfully solved. The city sat on its island, half a kilometre from the mainland coast. The island fortress had natural harbours on both its landward and seaward sides, allowing Tyre to receive supplies and reinforcements by sea even when its land connection was cut off. Its walls, reinforced over centuries, rose from the water's edge. An army that could not operate at sea could surround the city, blockade the land approach, and wait. But waiting meant feeding an army for an indefinite period, while the city, receiving supplies by ship, could potentially hold out indefinitely. Nebuchadnezzar began his siege of Tyre around 585 BC, following his successful campaign against Jerusalem. The ancient sources, primarily the Hebrew prophet Ezekiel, who wrote a remarkable extended lament and denunciation against Tyre during this period, and later classical authors, give us a picture of the siege that is broadly consistent, if not entirely precise, in its details. The siege lasted, according to the most reliable ancient source, 13 years. 13 years of Babylonian forces blockading the landward approach to Tyre, attempting to disrupt the sea supply lines and applying whatever pressure was available to a land-based army against an island city with a functioning navy. The Tyrians, for their part, maintained their commercial operations to whatever extent possible, used their naval capacity to keep sea lanes open, and negotiated continuously for terms that would preserve their essential autonomy. The eventual resolution of the siege, around 572 BC, was not a military victory for either side in any clean sense. Tyre negotiated a settlement that involved acknowledging Babylonian suzerainty and paying tribute, but the city was not destroyed, its population was not deported, and its commercial capacity was not eliminated. Nebuchadnezzar had effectively won a political acknowledgement without achieving a military conquest. Tyre had survived 13 years of siege without surrendering its independence unconditionally. The prophet Ezekiel's oracles against Tyre, preserved in chapters 26 through 28 of the biblical book of Ezekiel, are extraordinary documents for the historian of Phoenician commerce, even though their purpose is denunciation rather than description. Ezekiel catalogues the trading partners and commodities of Tyre in detail that reads almost like a commercial directory. Silver, iron, tin, and lead from Spain, horses, war horses, and mules from Asia Minor, ivory and ebony from Africa, embroidered linen from Egypt, spices, gold, and precious stones from Arabia, lapis lazuli, purple, and embroidered work from Mesopotamia. This catalogue, embedded in a prophetic condemnation of Tyre's wealth and pride, provides one of the most detailed pictures of the Phoenician commercial network at its height that any ancient source preserves. The aftermath of the Babylonian siege accelerated a process that had already been underway for some time. the shift of Phoenician commercial and political gravity westward, toward Carthage and the other western settlements. The eastern Mediterranean cities, subject to the demands of successive imperial powers, Assyrian, then Babylonian, remained important, but the center of Phoenician power was increasingly located in the west, where Carthage was developing the institutional capacity to function as a genuinely independent great power. The conquest of Babylon by Cyrus the Great in 539 BC brought the Phoenician cities into the Persian Empire, a transition that proved, in many respects, to be more advantageous for Phoenician interests than the Babylonian period had been. The Persian imperial system was different from the Assyrian and Babylonian models in ways that mattered to the Phoenician cities. The Achaemenid kings, Cyrus, Cambyses, Darius, Xerxes, and their successors, governed a vast, multi-ethnic empire through a system that, while demanding in its tribute requirements, generally allowed subject peoples to maintain their local institutions, their religious practices, and their commercial customs, provided they paid what was owed and supplied what was demanded militarily. The Persians were not primarily interested in cultural homogenization. They were interested in revenue and military capacity. For the Phoenician cities, this meant something specific and immediately valuable: continued commercial autonomy in exchange for tribute, skilled craftspeople, and, most significantly, naval service. The Phoenician cities possessed the finest warships and the most experienced sailors in the Mediterranean world. This made them indispensable to any power that needed to project military force at sea, and the Persian Empire, in its conflicts with the Greek city-states, needed exactly that. The Phoenician fleet, the combined naval forces of Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and the other coastal cities, formed the core of the Persian naval force in the great campaigns against Greece in 490 and 480 BC. At the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC, the naval engagement that the Athenians regarded as the most important victory in their history, a substantial portion of the fleet that the Athenians defeated was Phoenician. The Phoenician ships were among the best in the Persian fleet, and their loss was a significant factor in the Persian defeat. This role as the naval arm of the Persian Empire came with corresponding privileges. Persian royal patronage funded construction and urban development in the Phoenician cities. Sidon, in particular, appears to have prospered dramatically during the Persian period. Its coinage, its public buildings, and the quality of its craftwork all suggest a city enjoying the benefits of imperial patronage. Sidonian coins from the Persian period, bearing images of Phoenician galleys and Persian warships, are among the finest numismatic products of the ancient world, and they circulated widely enough to function effectively as a regional currency. The cultural blending of the Persian period produced an architectural and artistic tradition that scholars call Persian Phoenician, a fusion visible in the sarcophagi, the ritual objects, and the architectural decorations of the Levantine coast cities during the 5th and 4th centuries BC. Persian royal imagery, the winged disc, the royal hunting scene, the formal court ceremony, was absorbed into Phoenician decorative vocabulary alongside the older Egyptian and local Levantine traditions that had always characterized Phoenician craft production. The Persian Empire's attitude toward the Phoenician cities was not, however, simply benign patronage. Tribute demands were real and sometimes onerous. Military service, providing ships, crews, and the skilled officers to command them, extracted resources and personnel that might otherwise have been directed toward commercial purposes. And the consequences of failure or disloyalty could be severe. When Sidon revolted against Persian authority in the 340s BC, the city was burned, whether by the Persians in conquest or by the Sidonians themselves to prevent Persian capture is debated. And tens of thousands of people died. the religious life of the Phoenician cities is documented less fully than their commercial and political history, partly because the Phoenicians themselves did not produce the kind of systematic theological texts that survive from Mesopotamia or Egypt, and partly because much of what ancient sources, primarily Greek and Roman authors, and the Hebrew Bible, say about Phoenician religion is filtered through hostile perspectives. The chief deity of the Phoenician cities was Baal, a title meaning lord or master that was applied to various local divine figures, each associated with a specific city or natural phenomenon. The Baal of Tyre, Baal Shemem, Lord of Heaven, was the city's patron deity, worshipped in a great temple that ancient sources describe as extraordinarily wealthy and elaborately appointed. The specific form of Baal worship in each Phoenician city was distinct, and the Baals of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos were understood as different manifestations of divine power, rather than identical gods with different names. Astarte, the great goddess of love, fertility, and war, whose worship was central to Phoenician religion, was the female counterpart to Baal in the Phoenician pantheon. Her cult spread from Phoenicia across the Mediterranean world through exactly the same commercial networks that carried Phoenician trade goods. The Greek goddess Aphrodite appears to have been shaped, at least in part, by contact with the Astarte cult. The associations between Aphrodite and Cyprus, an island where Phoenician presence was strong, reflect this connection. The Roman Venus, in turn, inherited from Aphrodite. The trail from Phoenician Astarte to the Roman goddess of love is one of the clearer examples of how Phoenician cultural influence permeated the classical world. The goddess of Byblos, known to classical authors as the Lady of Byblos, had ancient Egyptian connections and was one of the earlier elements of the Phoenician divine world. The mythology preserved in later sources connects her to the Osiris cycle, the Egyptian myth of death and resurrection, in ways that suggest an early synthesis between Phoenician and Egyptian religious traditions. The temples of the Phoenician cities were not simply places of worship, they were also economic institutions, holders of wealth, organizers of craft production in some cases, and participants in the commercial networks that the city itself operated. Temple revenues, in the form of offerings from merchants and sailors seeking divine protection for their voyages and transactions, added to the institutional wealth of the religious establishment. Priests occupied positions of social authority that extended beyond the purely religious, participating in civic governance and commercial regulation in ways that blurred the line between religious and secular administration. The question of human sacrifice in Phoenician religion, specifically in the Carthaginian tradition, has been one of the most contested topics in Phoenician studies for more than a century. Classical Greek and Roman sources describe the Carthaginians sacrificing children to their chief god, and the term Tophet has been applied to what appear to be sacred precincts containing cremated remains. Modern archaeological and scholarly opinion is divided. Some scholars accept the ancient testimony as evidence of a real practice, while others argue that the ancient accounts are hostile propaganda and that the Tophets represent ordinary child burial rather than sacrifice. The evidence does not currently permit a definitive conclusion, and any claim to certainty in either direction goes beyond what the historical record supports. The Phoenician cities were governed by kings, but they were kingdoms in which the merchant class exercised more practical influence over civic life than was typical in the palace-based states of the ancient Near East. This was, in a fundamental sense, an unavoidable consequence of the economic structure that sustained the cities. Wealth came from trade, and trade was conducted by merchant families. A king who consistently ignored the interests of the great merchant houses was a king undermining the economic foundations of his own state. The merchant princes, the great commercial families, whose networks extended across the Mediterranean, were the real power behind the Phoenician cities in many respects. They financed expeditions, maintained relationships with foreign trading partners, owned the warehouses and ships that made commercial activity possible, and employed the craftspeople whose skills produced the luxury goods that commanded premium prices. Their wealth gave them leverage with the king that the agricultural landowners or military aristocrats of more conventional ancient states could not match. The legal framework that governed Phoenician commercial life was built around the contract, the written agreement between parties specifying the terms of a commercial relationship, enforced through the city's legal institutions. The Phoenician alphabetic script made contract documentation accessible to a much broader range of commercial actors than any earlier writing system had allowed, and the habit of recording agreements in writing was embedded in Phoenician commercial culture from an early stage. The evidence for the internal social structure of Phoenician cities comes from multiple sources: inscriptions, archaeological finds, and the accounts of neighboring cultures, each of which has its own limitations and biases. What emerges is a picture of a society sharply stratified between the commercial elite and the mass of workers, sailors, craftspeople, and agricultural laborers who sustained the elite's commercial operations. Slavery was practiced, as it was throughout the ancient world, and the Phoenician slave trade, the movement of enslaved people as a commercial commodity alongside other goods, was a component of the commercial network. The education, elite children reflected the priorities of a commercial culture. Mathematical competence, the ability to calculate prices, weights, exchange rates, and profit margins, was essential. Navigation, the ability to read stars, coastlines, and seasonal winds, was equally important for a culture whose wealth depended on maritime commerce. The Phoenician astronomical knowledge, accumulated over centuries of navigation, was substantial, even if it was never systematized into a theoretical framework in the way that Babylonian astronomy was. The architectural character of Phoenician cities reflected the specific constraints of their coastal sites. Building land was limited, particularly on the island of Tyre, where every square meter of buildable space was precious. Buildings were tall by ancient standards, multi-storied structures that used vertical space to compensate for limited horizontal area. Ancient authors who visited Tyre commented on the height and density of its buildings with evident surprise, describing a cityscape that was unlike the more spaciously organized cities of the mainland. By the 6th century BC, Carthage had outgrown its status as a Phoenician daughter city and was developing into an independent great power with its own imperial ambitions and its own characteristic political and military institutions. The relationship with Tyre was maintained through ritual tribute, but the political and commercial decisions of Carthage were made in Carthage, by Carthaginian institutions, in the interests of Carthaginian power. The political system of Carthage, as described by Greek and Roman sources, most extensively by Aristotle, who devoted a section of his politics to a generally admiring analysis of Carthaginian governance, was a mixed constitution combining monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic elements. Two magistrates called sufetes, a Semitic word related to the Hebrew word for judge, served as the chief executives of the city, elected annually. A council of elders, the Gerousia in Greek sources, exercised considerable power over policy, and a popular assembly was consulted on major questions, though its role in routine governance appears to have been limited. Aristotle considered the Carthaginian constitution one of the best designed in the ancient world, comparing it favorably to the Spartan and Cretan systems, and noting that it had produced stability over a long period, without the violent factional conflicts that troubled many Greek cities. The combination of competitive elections for the suffetes, the deliberative role of the council, and the occasional consultation of the popular assembly created a system of checks that prevented the accumulation of unchecked power in any single institution or individual. The military of Carthage relied heavily on mercenaries, soldiers recruited from across the Western Mediterranean and North Africa, paid for their service rather than fighting out of civic obligation. This was different from the citizen soldier armies of Greece, and it had specific advantages and disadvantages. Mercenary armies could be composed of specialists, Numidian cavalry from North Africa, Balearic slingers from the islands off the Spanish coast, Spanish infantry, whose specific skills complemented each other in ways that a citizen militia could not match. But mercenary armies required constant payment, and unpaid mercenaries were a persistent source of political instability. The conflict between Carthage and the Greek cities of Sicily, particularly Syracuse, was the defining military struggle of Carthage's independent period. Sicily was the largest island in the Mediterranean and sat directly astride the sea routes between the Phoenician west and the eastern Mediterranean. Both Carthage and the Greek cities of Sicily wanted to dominate the island, and the result was a series of wars, negotiated settlements, and renewed conflicts that stretched from the 6th century BC to the 3rd century BC, and that consumed enormous resources on both sides, without producing any permanent resolution. In 334 BC, Alexander of Macedon crossed into Asia with an army of approximately 40,000 men and began the conquest that would eventually bring him to India. By 333 BC, he had defeated the Persian forces at Issus in southern Turkey and was moving south along the Levantine coast toward Egypt. The great cities of the Phoenician coast, Byblos, Sidon, Aradus, surrendered to him as he approached, opening their gates and receiving him with the pragmatic flexibility that generations of dealing with successive imperial powers had taught them. Tyre did not. The Tyrian response to Alexander's approach was not a flat refusal to negotiate. It was a careful political position that attempted to maintain Tyre's traditional status of acknowledged neutrality between competing powers. The Tyrians offered to recognize Alexander's suzerainty and to pay whatever tribute he required, but they refused to allow him to enter the city and sacrifice at the temple of Melkart, the great Tyrian deity whom Alexander identified with Heracles and whom he wished to propitiate as part of claiming the religious legitimacy of the Persian Empire he was replacing. This refusal was not irrational from the Tyrian perspective. Allowing Alexander into the city would have made Tyre a Macedonian base, exposed it to the consequences of a Macedonian defeat if the Persian navy, still largely Phoenician in composition since the mainland cities had submitted without fighting, managed to reverse Alexander's tide of conquest. The island fortress that had held out against Nebuchadnezzar for 13 years seemed, on any reasonable military analysis, capable of resisting Alexander long enough for the strategic situation to change. Alexander's response was to do what no previous conqueror had done. He built a causeway. The construction of the mole from the mainland to the island of Tyre, a causeway approximately 60 meters wide, built across half a kilometer of shallow water, using the rubble of the demolished mainland city of Tyre as fill material, was one of the great engineering projects of the ancient world. The work was slow, dangerous, and bitterly contested. Tyrian warships attacked the workers from the flanks. The causeway initially advanced across relatively shallow water, but as it neared the island, the depth increased, the Tyrian resistance intensified, and construction was repeatedly disrupted. Alexander responded to the naval threat by assembling his own fleet, gathering ships from the Phoenician cities that had already submitted, from Cyprus, from other Eastern Mediterranean sources, until he had a force large enough to challenge Tyrian naval dominance. With a fleet covering his flanks and providing mobile platforms for artillery and siege equipment, the causeway construction could continue despite Tyrian opposition. The siege lasted 7 months, from January to July 332 BC. The Tyrian defenders, approximately 30,000 people were in the city, together with military forces of uncertain size, fought with the creativity and desperation of people who understood exactly what defeat meant. They constructed cranes to drop heavy stones on attackers. They invented heated sand that poured through crevices in armor and caused terrible burns. They stretched animal hides across their walls to absorb the impact of artillery projectiles. Every approach that Alexander's engineers devised, the Tyrians countered with ingenuity born of necessity. When the walls were finally breached in late July 332 BC, Alexander's army entered a city that had been fighting continuously for 7 months. Based on the ancient accounts, primarily Arrian's history of Alexander's campaigns, which draws on the account of Ptolemy, who was present, approximately 8,000 Tyrians were killed in the final assault. 6,000 of military age were executed afterward as examples, and 30,000 were sold into slavery. The city itself was not destroyed. Alexander recognized its value as a harbour, but its population was replaced and its independent status ended permanently. The causeway that Alexander built still exists. Over the centuries since 332 BC, silt accumulation has widened it and connected it more firmly to both the island and the mainland. Tyre today is no longer an island. It is a peninsula. Its isolation ended by the engineering that brought it down. The fall of Tyre in 332 BC did not end Phoenician civilization, but it fundamentally altered its character. The cities of the Levantine coast, Tyre rebuilt with a new population, Sidon, which had submitted to Alexander and been treated relatively gently, Byblos and the other northern cities continued to exist and to function as commercial centers. But they now did so within the framework of the Hellenistic world that Alexander's conquests had created, a world in which Greek language, Greek culture, and Greek institutional forms were the prestige markers of urban sophistication. The process of Hellenization, the adoption of Greek language, Greek names, Greek architectural forms, and Greek cultural practices by populations throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, was gradual rather than sudden, and it was driven as much by the practical advantages of Greek cultural literacy in the new imperial context as by any forced imposition. A Phoenician merchant who could conduct business in Greek, who understood Greek commercial and legal customs, who could navigate the institutions of Hellenistic cities organized around Greek civic forms, that merchant had significant advantages over one who could not. The Phoenician alphabet, which the Phoenicians themselves continued to use in religious contexts and in Carthage for several more centuries, was gradually displaced in the Levantine cities by Greek script for commercial and administrative purposes. The inscriptions that survive from Hellenistic period Phoenician cities are increasingly in Greek. The names recorded on those inscriptions are increasingly Greek names, or Phoenician names rendered in Greek forms. The religious dedications increasingly invoke Greek deities alongside or instead of the traditional Phoenician gods. The great temple of Melkart at Tyre, the sanctuary whose religious independence had been the stated reason for Tyre's defiance of Alexander, continued to function, but its patron was increasingly identified with the Greek hero Heracles, rather than maintained as a distinctly Phoenician divine figure. Astarte merged with Aphrodite. Baal absorbed aspects of Zeus and Kronos in the interpretations that Greek-educated writers applied to Phoenician religious traditions. The displacement of Phoenician cultural identity in the eastern homeland made Carthage and the western colonies the primary bearers of the Phoenician tradition in its more independent form. Punic, the western branch of the Phoenician language, continued to be used in Carthage, in North Africa, and in the Phoenician colonies of Spain and Sardinia for centuries after Greek had displaced Phoenician in the Levant. Punic inscriptions from North Africa continue into the Roman period, and Punic was spoken in some rural areas of North Africa as late as the 4th century AD, nearly 1,000 years after Alexander's conquest of Tyre. The Phoenician contribution to human civilization was, by any measure, disproportionate to the size of the territory they occupied or the length of time they existed as a distinct cultural entity. The alphabet alone would be sufficient to place them among the most consequential civilizations in history. Everything else they contributed was additional. The alphabet that the Phoenicians standardized and disseminated spread from their commercial network into every corner of the ancient world with which they had contact. The Greeks received it, added vowels to create a system capable of representing the full range of Greek sounds, and produced the ancestor of every alphabet currently used in Europe and the Americas. The Greeks also transmitted it eastward. The Aramaic script, derived from Phoenician, became the ancestor of the Hebrew, Arabic, Syriac, and several other scripts in current use. The Latin alphabet, in which this text is written, descends from the Greek, which descends from the Phoenician. The 26 letters of the English alphabet are the direct descendants of the 22 letters that Phoenician merchants used to record their commercial transactions 3,000 years ago. The navigational knowledge accumulated by Phoenician sailors over centuries of Mediterranean and Atlantic voyaging was substantial, even if much of it was never written down in a form that survived. The Phoenicians navigated by the stars, specifically by the North Star, which the Greeks called the Phoenician star, in recognition of who had taught them to use it for navigation. The techniques of dead reckoning, of reading coastal landmarks, of understanding the seasonal patterns of winds and currents in the Mediterranean, all of this was embedded in the practical knowledge of Phoenician sailors and transmitted through generations of seafaring practice. The circumnavigation of Africa, attributed to Phoenician sailors, sent by the Egyptian Pharaoh Necho II around 600 BC, according to the account preserved by the Greek historian Herodotus, remains one of the most discussed episodes in ancient geographical history. Herodotus himself expresses skepticism about one detail of the account. The sailors reported that as they rounded the southern tip of Africa, the sun was on their right, that is, to the north. Herodotus found this implausible. To a modern reader who knows that the sun is indeed in the northern sky when you are south of the equator, this detail is precisely what makes the account credible. It is the kind of specific observational detail that a fabricator would not have known to include, and it suggests that the account preserves a genuine memory of a voyage that actually took place. The glass-making tradition that the Phoenicians developed had lasting effects on material culture across the ancient world, and ultimately contributed to the development of the glass industry that, through the Roman period and the medieval Islamic world, eventually produced the sophisticated glass technology of the modern world. The window glass that admits light into your home, the bottles that contain beverages, the optical lenses that correct human vision, these are the descendants of a tradition that Phoenician craftspeople developed and commercialized along the Levantine coast. The influence of Phoenician commercial practice on the development of Mediterranean trade is more diffuse but equally significant. The concept of the trading post, the strategically located commercial foundation that extended a merchant network into new territory without requiring the full infrastructure of a colony, was central to Phoenician expansion and was subsequently adopted by both Greeks and Romans in their own commercial expansions. The legal frameworks governing maritime commerce, the insurance arrangements that spread the risk of long-distance voyaging, the partnerships that pooled capital for expensive expeditions. These commercial institutions, developed in the Phoenician trading world, entered the broader Mediterranean commercial tradition and eventually contributed to the development of the commercial law and practice of classical antiquity. The Punic Wars, the three great conflicts between Rome and Carthage that spanned the period from 264 to 146 BC, were the final chapter in the story of Phoenician independent power. The specific question of why Rome and Carthage went to war, and whether the wars were inevitable, has occupied historians since they ended, and no consensus has emerged that satisfies every perspective. What is clear is that the two powers came into conflict over Sicily, that the conflict expanded to encompass Spain and North Africa, and that the Second War, the conflict in which Hannibal crossed the Alps with elephants and won a series of stunning victories in Italy before ultimately failing to take Rome itself, came closer than any other episode in Roman history to ending the Roman Republic. Hannibal's campaign in Italy is one of the greatest military stories in the ancient world, and it belongs to Carthaginian history as much as to Roman history. At Cannae in 216 BC, Hannibal's forces inflicted one of the worst defeats in Roman history, killing perhaps 50,000 Roman soldiers in a single battle. Rome did not surrender. It raised new armies and returned to the field, and it applied to Carthage the same lesson that Carthage had applied to others. When you cannot defeat the enemy in the field, attack what he depends on. Scipio Africanus took the war to Spain, then to North Africa, and Hannibal was recalled from Italy to face him. The Battle of Zama in 202 BC ended the Second Punic War with Roman victory and Carthaginian capitulation. The terms imposed on Carthage were harsh, but not terminal. Carthage was stripped of its overseas territories and its navy, required to pay a massive indemnity, and forbidden to make war without Roman permission. It remained a city, and it recovered economically to a degree that alarmed Roman senators, who remembered what Carthaginian power had meant. The Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BC, was the product of that alarm. Rome demanded that Carthage abandon its coastal site and rebuild inland, a demand that was, for a trading city, functionally equivalent to a demand for suicide. Carthage refused. Roman armies besieged the city for 3 years. When Carthage finally fell in 146 BC, it was destroyed completely, its buildings demolished, its population killed or enslaved, and, in the tradition that the Romans salted the earth to prevent anything from growing there, though this specific detail may be a later legend rather than historical fact, the site made uninhabitable. The silence that followed the fall of Carthage was not, however, complete. The Punic language survived in rural North Africa for centuries. The traditions of Phoenician craft, the glassmaking, the textile production, the metalwork, continued in modified form in the Roman provinces of the region. Inscriptions in Neo-Punic script, the descendant of the Phoenician alphabet, appear in North Africa well into the first centuries of the Common Era. The rediscovery of Phoenician civilization by modern scholarship has proceeded through both textual and archaeological means. The decipherment of the Phoenician script, accomplished in the early 19th century, building on the bilingual inscriptions that provided the key, opened the surviving Phoenician inscriptions to analysis. The excavation of Phoenician sites along the Lebanese coast, in Cyprus, in North Africa, and across the Western Mediterranean has produced the material record that supplements and sometimes corrects what the ancient literary sources preserved. The Phoenicians occupy an unusual position in cultural memory. They were remembered by the civilizations that succeeded them, but remembered partially and often through the hostile perspectives of their rivals. The Hebrew Bible preserves extensive evidence of Phoenician commercial and cultural relationships with Israel, but frames them in terms of religious competition and moral condemnation. The Greek and Roman sources acknowledge Phoenician commercial brilliance, while sometimes depicting Phoenicians as tricky, morally flexible traders. The Romans, who destroyed Carthage, wrote the history that shaped European understanding of the Punic world for centuries. What the physical evidence, the inscriptions, the objects, the ship's cargo, recovers is a civilization that was, in its practical achievements, among the most consequential in human history. The alphabet that carries these words, the navigational knowledge that made the Mediterranean a connected world rather than a barrier, the commercial practices that established the patterns of long-distance trade, the dye that made purple the color of power, the glass that eventually became windows and lenses and bottles, the city of Carthage that held Rome to its limit for a century and a half. The Phoenicians did not build the kind of monuments that announce themselves across the millennia. No pyramids, no colossal temples, no inscribed accounts of royal conquests that were meant to outlast everything. They built ships and wrote on perishable materials and taught the people they traded with the tools of literacy and navigation and commerce. Their legacy is not in stone. It is in the structures of the world they helped to create. The interconnected, literate, commercially sophisticated world of the Mediterranean and beyond, whose foundations they laid in the harbour cities of the Lebanese coast 3,000 years ago. There is a paradox at the centre of Phoenician history that has no clean resolution. These were the people who invented the alphabet, the single most democratic and widely adopted intellectual tool in human history, a system that stripped literacy of its specialist barriers and made it available to anyone who could learn 22 letters. And yet, the Phoenicians themselves left relatively little written record compared to the civilizations around them. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia, the papyrus scrolls of Egypt, the inscribed stone stelae of the Assyrian kings, the ancient world is rich in text. The Phoenicians wrote primarily on perishable materials, papyrus, wood, cloth. Their commercial records, their correspondence, their literature if they had any, almost all of it is gone. What survives is inscriptions on stone and metal, and those inscriptions are overwhelmingly brief. Dedications to gods, funerary markers, commemorative texts. They tell us that certain people existed, that certain transactions took place, that certain religious obligations were fulfilled. They do not tell us what the Phoenicians thought about the world, how they understood their own history, what stories they told each other about where they came from and where they were going. The inner life of Phoenician civilization is largely inaccessible, and it is inaccessible precisely because of the practical orientation that characterized Phoenician culture. The preference for writing on materials that served the immediate purpose but did not last. This silence has allowed other people's characterizations to fill the space. The Hebrew prophets' condemnations of Tyrian pride and Sidonian luxury. The Greek descriptions of Phoenician merchants as clever and not entirely trustworthy. The Roman presentation of the Carthaginians as treacherous enemies. The Latin phrase Punic faith became, in Roman usage, a synonym for bad faith, an inversion that said more about Roman propaganda than Carthaginian ethics. These external characterizations, repeated across centuries of classical scholarship, shaped the picture of Phoenician civilization that survived into modernity. The material evidence that archaeology has recovered tells a different and more complex story. The objects that Phoenician craftspeople made, the carved ivories, the glass vessels, the intricate metalwork, the finely woven purple textiles, speak of a culture with genuine aesthetic sensibility and high technical achievement. The commercial systems they built, the network of trading posts, the alphabet that enabled widespread literacy, the navigational knowledge that opened the Western Mediterranean and the Atlantic to regular commerce, speak of a culture with extraordinary practical intelligence and organizational capacity. The most significant Phoenician achievement in the long view of history was the creation of a model for what a civilization could be that was not based on military conquest, monumental architecture, or the accumulation of imperial territory. The Phoenician cities were small. Their armies, when they had them, were adequate for defense and deterrence, but were not instruments of conquest on the Assyrian or Persian scale. Their wealth was commercial rather than extractive. It came from what they made and what they carried, not from what they took. Their influence spread through the things they taught and sold, rather than through the populations they subjugated. This model, the trading civilization, the commercial republic, the maritime power that extends its reach through exchange rather than conquest, recurs throughout history. The Italian city-states of the medieval and Renaissance period, the Dutch Republic at its commercial height in the 17th century, the British commercial empire at its most dynamic phase, each of these has been compared, by historians who recognize the pattern, to the Phoenician original. Each of them face the same ultimate vulnerability: a commercial civilization that is not itself organized for conquest is permanently exposed to conquest by states that are. The Phoenician response to this vulnerability, maintaining commercial relationships with every successive imperial power, providing naval services, paying tribute, preserving commercial autonomy within political subordination, was pragmatic and generally successful for long periods. It failed, ultimately, against Alexander, whose military genius and personal ambition could not be accommodated by any negotiated arrangement. And it failed for Carthage against Rome, whose determination to eliminate any potential rival was stronger than any commercial calculation could counter. But the legacy did not fail. The alphabet is used by billions of people daily, in languages and for purposes that the Tyrian merchants who standardized it could not have imagined. The navigational tradition they developed contributed to the knowledge base that eventually enabled the European voyages of discovery. The commercial practices they pioneered evolved through Carthage and then Rome, and then the medieval Mediterranean trading world, into the commercial institutions of modernity. And the simple fact of the interconnected Mediterranean, a sea that was a highway rather than a barrier, a shared space in which ideas, goods, people, and practices moved freely across cultural boundaries, was, in large part, a Phoenician creation. They built their civilization out of the things that do not last: wood and cloth and papyrus and salt water. And yet what they built has outlasted the stone monuments of the powers that surrounded and eventually absorbed them. That is the Phoenician paradox, and it is the most instructive lesson their story offers.